Good afternoon. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Welcome to the Select Committee hearing. For the record, could you please state your name and the position you hold in your organization?
My name is Professor Gerald Steinberg. I am a professor of political science at Bar Ilan University, and I'm also the president of NGO Monitor Research Institute.
Okay. Thank you. The evidence which you will be giving today before the committee will be taken on affirmation. The clerk will now administer the affirmation.
Professor, can you please raise your right hand?
Yes.
And repeat after me. I state your name.
I, Gerald Steinberg,
do solemnly,
sincerely,
and truly declare
and affirm
that
the evidence which I shall give before this committee
shall be the truth,
the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Welcome to the public hearing on the Select Committee on Deliberate Online Falsehoods. The focus for today's evidence gathering session is for us to put questions to you. You have taken a solemn obligation to answer our questions truthfully, and I will now call on Mr. Edwin Tong to start the questions.
Good afternoon, Prof.
Good afternoon.
Prof, what I propose to do is to go through your report, which I think you have in front of you, which we have all read, but I'd like to take you to certain specific parts of the report to ask you for some clarification, or in some other cases to ask you to elaborate on the examples that you've given. Okay?
Okay. Could I ask the technical people to raise the volume if it's possible, that I can hear you a little bit better?
Okay, I'll also speak closer to the mic. Let me just arrange that. Is this better?
I think that's better.
Right. Now, Prof. Steinberg, you have in your report used Israel or the experiences of Israel as a focus, and to use that to share some examples or some lessons with us in Singapore as we deliberate and study the issue of online falsehoods. Correct?
That is correct.
Israel has itself been the target of sustained, sophisticated, coordinated campaign of delegitimization for several years. Correct?
That is correct.
And that's largely been done through the use of gross distortions, falsehoods, particularly against Israel in the UN, by powerful NGOs, which we'll come to in a minute, mainstream media, as well as social media platforms. That would be correct?
That's an accurate summary, yes.
And you've also taken the view that social media, particularly Twitter and Facebook, has, in your words, greatly amplified this problem. Would you care to elaborate on that briefly?
For the last at least 15 years, there has been a very specific and articulated campaign using what's called soft power, sometimes it's called political warfare, to the terms that are used are to create a situation for the complete international isolation of Israel. That's a statement from a group of 1,500 non-governmental organizations that met in Durban, South Africa in September 2001. And they established a series of procedures such as allegations of apartheid, allegations of war crimes, allegations of ethnic cleansing, in a situation in which none of those terms even remotely apply. And then over the last 15, 16 years, they've been developing this strategy. They've been implementing this strategy. I focus particularly on NGOs, non-governmental organizations, groups that claim to be part of a human rights network, because that was an area of research that was completely empty. Nobody had looked at that, and I decided at that time, 15, 16 years ago, that was important to examine. It's not the only factor in the process. because very often a very powerful NGO, these are worldwide organizations, groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, and many others, will issue condemnations, will issue reports based on hearsay, based often on second, third, fourth-hand testimonies, which they cannot check. They do not check. They sometimes are testimonies, which usually have been orchestrated. And then those are published in mainstream media outlets, not just in terms of Facebook and Twitter and social media, where there is a serious problem as well, but also in mainstream media outlets throughout the world, in most cases without bothering to check the accuracy of those claims. Mm-hmm. And there's a third element, with your permission, I'll just add right now, and that is the allegations. There are questions of fact and there are questions of analysis, because we get the factual allegations that would claim that a certain number of people, civilians, were killed, and of course, they may not be civilians, they may not have been killed, there may be, all these questions are left open, but then those same organizations declare these activities, which may or may not have taken place, to be violations of international law, and those things are also quoted without any serious analysis of whether, in fact, how international law may or may not play into this process. So you have this combination of factors together, which have been used, again, very consciously as part of a political warfare strategy.
Right. Thank you, Prof. I understand that. Would you say that such information would travel reasonably well on the social media platforms, being in a sense that
it's almost
instantaneous?
The claims that are made by these organizations, and sometimes they may come straight from the media, are immediately picked up. That's the nature of social media. Yes. And as I said in my submitted testimony, and I can elaborate on that, Facebook, Twitter, even Instagram, other blogs, they are instantly circulated. And what we usually have is a phenomenon where you may have a few thousand or sometimes a few tens of thousands of either real or fake accounts that immediately will copy and paste and like and retweet and quote exactly the same claims that are made. And then they take on a life of their own, in which, again, there is almost no effort made to evaluate the accuracy both of the factual claims or of the analysis, the legal claims. And certainly the social media makes this happen almost instantaneously. And for a government, for a responsible government, where the facts have to be checked, where, let's say, there might have been an incident and the government wants to determine whether, in fact, that incident, the description of that incident, including claims of casualties, was accurate, a government, a military force, police force, security forces don't have the luxury of making instant claims. So the false claims stay on the social media for a long time before the responsible parties are able to counter those. And even if it's 5 hours late or 1 day late, it's almost impossible in those situations to deal with that process.
Right. Thank you, Prof. And going back to your paper, I think that's also the experience you shared, because you explained that the Israeli initial counter strategies was done through the old media platforms, and that proved to be ineffective, much slower.
Yes, I would say the old days, if we go back 20, 30 years, then there was, I would say, more of a balance in terms of the time process.
Okay.
That the media claims, and also if you go back 10, 15, 20 years, the NGOs were not nearly as politically powerful. They certainly became more powerful for reasons that have to do with the media itself, but also with legal processes and other aspects we can talk about later. But in the previous era, where we had what's called mainstream media, and I think journalists were more careful. They were less interested, or there was less emphasis on instant headline grabbing and how many retweets and how many likes you get, so that journalists, and I'm saying this somewhat carefully because I think a broad statement is difficult to do, but there was greater concern, greater care, greater professionalism in making these allegations. Also, they didn't have the access that you have now. If somebody claims to be in a an area where there is an incident, let's say a terror attack, and there are people that are injured or killed, and some of them may be terrorists or may not be civilians. It's part of the asymmetric warfare situation, because there tends to be always terrorism takes place in a civilian environment, and to sort out the details of what happened. A journalist in the previous era would spend the time, because the next deadline would not be until the next morning. Now, there's somebody there with a camera, there's somebody there with a Facebook account and with Twitter, and they'll put it out there immediately, and that will become the basis for the narrative, not the way it took place 15 or 20 years ago when one waited for the journalist to report, and at the same time you had it maybe once a day. The newspaper would come out, the nightly news would be on, the radio would say it, but it would not be have this instant, I have to immediately claim to say things which I can't really verify and I don't really know.
Yes. So nowadays with a mobile phone, you can publish anything, whether it's text or photo, from anywhere in the world.
And that publication, that instant publication, will immediately get, because the network's in place, thousands of repetitions, retweets, quotes, and posts,
yes,
without any analysis of the accuracy.
Yes, and in fact, we've been told by some other witnesses who've come before you that sometimes these are all amplified through the use of bots, which are basically
Yes.
automatic but non-human devices, which would then influence the reach, the retweets, and in turn influence what one might then see on the social media platforms. Correct?
That process of amplifying artificially is well known. We now see the perhaps partly artificial bots and partly real people with fake names through the claims that of Russian influence on American elections and in other countries as well. The more powerful an organization is, the more powerful an NGO is, the more power, which means the larger the budget that they have. I'll give you the example of Human Rights Watch, which I've studied it in great detail. They don't have a public accounting in detail, but approximately their budget now is $75 million a year. For $75 million a year, you can buy a lot of technology.
Yes.
You can buy a lot of people who can create the bots, create the ability to amplify a claim of a violation of human rights, of a war crime, of some other area in which they are seen as experts. And that will then be picked up immediately, and then it's very difficult to refute that.
Right. Thank you, Prof.
So the
Steinberg.
bots do play an important amplification role in this area as well.
Yes, I understand. I will take you to one of your papers on Human Rights Watch, but maybe after I've gone through a couple of other questions concerning page 3 of your report, if I may ask you to please turn to that page. Here is where you deal with the subsequent line of responses by the subsequent line of countermeasure responses by the Israelis to meet the speed at which such information is being quickly purveyed, transmitted widely, and as you say, instantaneously. And if you just look at the first full paragraph from the top, right at the bottom, you say that false allegations are then quickly challenged on Twitter and Facebook, reducing the visibility and impact of these claims. You would describe that as having a lot more effect at being able to either counter entirely or at the very least mitigate effectively the falsehoods. Would you agree?
I would agree with that characterization, and it is reflected in my submitted evidence. If I might, with your permission, I can expand on that point.
Yes, please.
As I wrote, there are the Israeli government, which was the target of these attacks, this soft power warfare and political warfare for many years, tried a number of strategies unsuccessfully. They tried legal strategies, legislation, countering in terms of media, but they were slow because of the need for accuracy. If a government is caught claiming something that they had not checked carefully, and it turns out to be incorrect, that it's a very strong penalty in terms of image. If an NGO makes a claim, and they often do, that are proven false, nobody pays much attention to that, and they continue, because they have their sources of funding, they continue to repeat that. And the Israeli government had a lot of trouble, therefore, dealing with these kinds of organizations at the beginning. And slowly, and more recently, they evolved a strategy of real-time responses. not just responses, but I would say not reaction, but pre-action in the sense of preparing the ground, knowing the pattern. And we saw that in the case of in 2010, where there was a flotilla of boats that were trying to break a blockade that Israel has imposed on arms that go to a terrorist organization in Gaza, Hamas and other terrorist groups. And that was a process in which NGOs and terrorist organizations work together, which is not unusual. And the goal of that process was not to actually provide humanitarian aid, but it was to embarrass the Israeli government in an incident in which the narrative, the pictures, the story would be entirely told from the NGO and terror organizations' perspective. And in this case, the Israeli government, having learned the failures over at least 10 years before that, had in place Twitter, Facebook, and mainstream media and all of the pieces. They were still, because they had to check the accuracy, there was still a few hours lag, but within 12 to 24 hours, the Israeli version was not only available, but it was available in video, and it was available in eyewitness testimony, and that served as a counterbalance. And over the years, the NGO and terror group narrative of what happened has not become the dominant narrative. And I would say there were still things that the Israeli government needs to be able to do to make that process more effective. But the fact that they were able within a few hours to put video material on, to put eyewitness testimony on, and repeat that did make a difference.
So what I'm hearing from you is that for an effective counterbalance, in your words, one has to be able to react quickly with speed. Would you agree?
I think one has to be able to fight the battle, as is the case in military and security areas, on the battlefield that the other side is using. So if the other side is using social media, then an effective counter to that has to also involve significantly social media with all the pieces already in place before the events take place.
Right. And one must also reduce, in your words again at page 3 of your report, one must also reduce the visibility and impact of these false claims. To reduce the visibility is an important aspect of that counterbalance, because we've heard that falsehoods travel faster than truths, and also falsehoods somehow, heuristically or otherwise, tend to feature more prominently on a reader's mind and is more believable and more likely to be believed. And so therefore, I would suggest that as part of the suite of options available for the counterbalance, the speed at which one could remove the false claim would be important. Would you agree?
I would agree that speed is extremely important. That is the most important dimension of social media in the political realm, is the speed with which reports travel without regard to their accuracy. There, in social media particularly, there is no mechanism for regulating, for examining the accuracy. And therefore, one must, to counter this, be very quick in the responses and have the mechanisms to do that, the technical aspects, the substantive aspects to do that. A few hours makes a huge difference. Even sometimes 1 hour can make a big difference because of the things that we talked about, the bots, the amplification. The entire process goes so very quickly. And sometimes that also means restricting access of NGOs so that they cannot claim to be on the spot and having accurate information. That's a complicated process, but it is part of the broader strategy that's being attempted.
Right. So the speed that you speak about has to be a combination of both being able to remove the false information as well as put out the true information in as quick a time as possible.
I agree with that to some degree. Removing false information is extremely difficult to do. There are very few legal aspects. There is a process now going on in Europe, the United States, is trying to regulate Facebook false allegations after the fact, and that's both technically difficult because it's a virus which duplicates so very quickly that you can, for instance, you can take a video off of YouTube and it will come back on sometimes within 5 minutes, and it's always, you're trying to hit the in the British terms, it's called whack-a-mole. Every time it comes up from the ground, you hit it, and then it comes back up in a different place. So removing falsehoods from false media is a very complicated and not always successful approach. Countering those falsehoods and overwhelming the ability of the whether it's the NGOs or the media or an opponent that's able to camouflage their activities through those processes, the ability to counter them with credible material, and then video again is very important to that.
Yes, I understand.
It's an important part.
I understand what you say. Leaving aside the technical difficulties, the whack-a-mole kind of scenario, I think you would agree that keeping the false information or misleading information online for longer than is necessary would have a very negative effect. So to the extent that you could remove it, to the extent that it's technically possible to remove it, I think one should do that or endeavor to do that as quickly as possible. Would you agree?
It is, yes, in theory. I just know that the experience of trying to get blatantly false information off the social media platforms is extremely difficult. With your permission, I can give you an example of that.
Yes.
If you have time. In 2002, and it goes back quite a while, but there was this was at the beginning of this period. The internet was active. There was not, I don't think we had Facebook yet in those days or Twitter, but there were other forms of internet viral activity. And there was a claim that was made that Israel, in preventing suicide bombings, which were killing hundreds of people, the Israeli military went into the center of these terrorist activities called Jenin, and there were battles there for a day, and the claim was made that the Israeli military had incurred a massacre. The word massacre was used. The first time that it was used by political propagandists, and then Amnesty International on the BBC claimed that this was a massacre. They said, we can confirm it. Now, the Amnesty had absolutely no idea. They had no access. Nobody was there. It was a closed military zone. It was a small area. And a year later, the NGOs and the United Nations agreed there was no massacre. But if you go onto the internet today and you look under the keywords, you will still see a lot of those allegations from Human Rights Watch, from Amnesty International, and from dozens of other smaller NGOs. So removing a blatantly false piece of information, deliberately false information, even under the best of circumstances, I would suggest from the experience, is extremely difficult to do. You won't get down to zero in most cases. You might be able to and I do agree that if you can reduce it by 50%, it's already an important accomplishment.
Yes.
But I think one should be realistic about how that's going to play out.
Yes, but I mean, the example you've just outlined tells us at least two things. The first is obviously taking steps to try to remove it to the extent possible would be the most ideal course of action. Whether one achieves it in practice or not is something else. Correct?
That is correct.
Yes.
And of course, because it's international, so that a national government can only be effective within its borders unless it goes to legal processes, and those take time. Whether it's in Europe or the United States or any place else in the world where there's a great access to open access to social media.
Right, and that's precisely one of the angles that this committee will be looking at. But the second takeaway from what you've said in your example would be that the fact that these misleading, untrue, false videos remain online and accessible itself tells you, and which then continues to create the effect of the misimpression, itself tells you that that's what needs to be done, to target the removal of these false information as soon as possible, subject, of course, always to the practicalities of doing so. Would you accept?
I would suggest to preempt, in the sense of it will be more effective if there are mechanisms, and I don't suggest that these are easy, but there is some work in this area, some experience, in preventing the initial posting of false information. And I specifically focus in an area where there are casualties, terrorist action in particular, and the ability to prevent the social media access. And I did say this with a great deal of caution in a democratic framework, but there are times when governments do impose blackouts on, and I think there are a number of aspects to that. It's not only in terms of false information, but it's also false information could be saying that a particular individual, we know that a particular, let's say someone puts on, and this has happened, on WhatsApp or on some other form of Twitter, we know there was a terrorist attack in a certain place, and a certain individual with a name was killed. And let's say that's false information. And we have instances of that.
I understand.
Then the families are immediately affected.
Yes.
It creates terrible tragedy. And if it's false information and it's only cleared up a few hours later because in a terrorist environment you cannot immediately, responsible authorities cannot immediately sort out the details of casualties. And that false information already becomes online. If it was not online, if there was a blackout in the area of the terrorist incident, then in terms of being able to post in social media, that's a technical issue. And many governments now have that capability. Then the false information, as is case of military, when there's a battle taking place in a military area, then there's a censorship that's imposed, and every government does that. Afghanistan and Iraq, and in the case of Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah and other places, that's a very standard practice. And it's important to protect the troops and to prevent the enemy from getting intelligence information. That can also be provided through Twitter and social media, so one has to be very careful about that access.
Yes. Now,
and that's preemption. That's before the falsehood gets on, you don't have to deal with the falsehoods if the ability to access the social media is limited under those very specific circumstances.
So either preempting or even prophylactically remove it before you can even get it online, to that extent.
That seems to me the more effective response, with the realization that there must be legal and other protective aspects to it. But
of course, but you see, Prof,
it's effective.
One of the issues that this committee will have to grapple with, of course, is starting with what is it that we want to achieve and what's best to be achieved. And then we start looking at what kind of legislation or other tools we might then have to achieve that. So what your evidence has been helpful for is to explain to us what we want to achieve. How we get there is a question that we might need to consult with the lawyers more closely. Now, I want to take you to a report that was done, and I think you are one of the co-authors. I'll have it put up on screen for you. It's a September 2009 paper that was written by NGO Monitor, and as I said, you're one of the authors. It's titled Experts or Ideologues. You have a second screen in front of you which would show it? Yes?
Yes, I have it.
Yes, right.
I have it in my hand and I see it on the screen.
Okay. Now, earlier you mentioned that there was some work that was done to look at what Human Rights Watch did in terms of their reports on Israel. And would this be one of those reports?
This is one of the, I would say, most intensive research reports that I've been involved in.
Yes.
And the organization I founded, NGO Monitor, as a research project. It was carefully done. It took a number of months to do. And I stand by every word that's in it. I think it was an important contribution.
Yes, and I think so. I've been through it. I'd like to take you through some parts of it and then invite your comments. So if you could start with, you will see the page numbers at the side of the page. If you start with page 7 on funding, there's a title, there's a subsection called funding on page 7.
I have the print, yes.
Yes. The first paragraph after the heading funding sets out what HRW assets total, and it's 122 million, and that was in 2008. Its annual spending exceeded 42 million, of which 31.8 went to program services and so on. That sort of buttresses what you said earlier about the budgets that they have or they operate under. The next paragraph, although HRW claims to refuse funding from government organizations, Oxfam Novib, funded largely by the Dutch government, provided approximately 1 million in 2008, and so on. A highly controversial HRW dinner held in May 2009 in Riyadh that included members of the government, Shura Council has been described as a fundraising event. Now, just using those few paragraphs as parameters, could you just elaborate on this and how HRW is funded?
This report was written. The data is from 2008. I will just note that now we're 10 years later, and the latest funding figures are almost double. They're 75 million. This money is a mix of, it's largely private money. Since the report was written, Human Rights Watch, and I think because of the report, Human Rights Watch has stopped publishing a detailed list of its donors and its sources of income. But the George Soros Open Society Institute is a major funder. We know publicly that they pledged to $100 million over a number of years, and that may be the largest source of funding. NGOs are an industry, and industries raise money, and a quarter of their budget is devoted to fundraising. And some of that money does come from governments, as noted, Oxfam Novib, which is itself funded by the Dutch government, as well as other private philanthropies. So they have a very effective fundraising machine. They did not publish details on whether or not they received money from governments, other than they also they had an event, I guess I'll call it, in Libya during the Gaddafi period, and they may or may not have received funding in that context. Right. It is an industry, and I'll say that in general. I'll let you if you want to focus me further on that, please go ahead.
No, it's okay. I'd like you to move on to page 10, which deals with the staff and board members of HRW, just to get your comment on this. Because you say here at page 10, that starting from the top, that HRW activity concerning Israel exhibits a strong and consistent bias, reflecting a post-colonialist ideological paradigm which a priori defines Palestinians as victims and paints Israel as the perennial aggressor. Over the next paragraph, such blatant prejudice inherent in the structure of this NGO is entirely inconsistent with the rigorous objective investigations that HRW claims to undertake and publish. What can you say about this in the context of the staffing and the makeup of HRW itself?
HRW is, I would say, is more than typical of the NGO human rights network and in this case, they were one of the first in this area. Although they make the claim to rigorous objective investigations, if one looks at their staffing, you see very often, very clearly, that they focus on a few issues. And they do that because those are the issues which conform to their ideology, which I would define as a radical, I don't like the term left and right, but I think in this case it's probably a shorthand form, a radical left-wing ideology. They focus their targets on the basis of that ideology, but also on the basis of media. If the media is covering a story, then they will be very much more involved and they will pump up the story. In the case of Africa, where there's almost no media coverage of very terrible examples of civil wars and killing violations of human rights, but that gets little media, they won't be there, or they'll have very limited analysis of that. And we can analyze the number of pages, the number of quotes, and that's what we did in this situation, as well as where their budget goes in the different areas. And so one sees a very, very strong emphasis, a disproportionate emphasis on the Middle East, far more than other areas. I would also add what's not in this section of the report, it perhaps was done after this report. The founder of Human Rights Watch, a gentleman by the name of Robert Bernstein, wrote an article, an op-ed piece, an opinion piece in the New York Times, in which he denounced his own organization for losing its moral compass. And I think that's based on the data that was provided in this report of the bias, of the ideological distortions that are very much predominant in the Human Rights Watch framework.
I'd like to take you to page 22, under the heading Part 2, the Research Facade, and ask you to look at a couple of paragraphs here before I ask for your comment. You have it? Yes, this paper says here, the following examination of some of HRW's research reports on Israel and related press statements demonstrates a consistent pattern of methodological distortion, deviations from universal human rights norms, and sweeping conclusions based on inadequate and/or insufficient evidence. The reports, the lengthy Palestinian testimonies which they include, and the recommendations on which they are based are violations of best practices standards for human rights fact-finding, as detailed in the London Guidelines. And thereafter, you have a couple of bullet points where you say that the studies reflect the following: 1, double standards with inconsistent definitions and applications regarding human shields, collective punishments, use of evidence, etc. 2, reliance on eyewitnesses with limited credibility due to inherent agendas or intimidation, acceptance of unverifiable evidence provided by Palestinian officials while rejecting Israeli evidence as inherently biased. 3, reliance on local political NGOs. 4, distortion of international legal standards and rhetoric in an attempt to justify biased claims and double standards. 5, artificially narrow focus using questionable technical claims regarding the use of specific weapons and tactics. And 6, repeated campaigns for ostensibly independent investigations focusing on allegations only against Israel, with the knowledge that these investigations are often guided by their own biased mandates, employ double standards, and rely on staff with partisan agendas. These are your observations on the findings of HRW. Would that be right?
That is correct. It's a summary of those particular case studies that are examined in this report.
And would you care to elaborate on the basis on which you have come to these conclusions?
I'm sorry, could you please repeat the question? I didn't quite hear it.
No, I asked you if you would be able to elaborate on the basis on which you have come to these conclusions.
This particular chapter has a number of case studies in it, extending from in the period of 2006, and this is only from 2006 through 2008 or 9. This is only a small part of the research that we were able to collect, where Human Rights Watch made statements, claiming statements of fact, on which they had no basis for making those conclusions. They were, one could argue, I'll use this a little bit less academically rigorous, that they circled the target and then they sent the research to hit the weapon. They circled the target. They wanted to prove that Israel was guilty, and then they went and looked for the evidence that might convince people who were already convinced that this was the case, instead of looking at all the evidence in a objective and professional manner. So the incidents which are listed in there are 5 of them, go through very specific sequence of events. Human Rights Watch, like other NGOs, but in particular this group, holds press conferences. And they make very strong accusations, condemnations in those about facts and also about international law. And they issue reports, and then they go from embassy to embassy and journalist to journalist, and they market their product.
Right.
In all of these cases, within a period of 6 months to a year, the evidence that they had was shown to be false. But there's no penalty for that. And so we put all of these pieces together, and we demonstrated a consistent pattern of failure in fact-finding, failure in evaluation, inconsistency within their own reports. Very often in the press conference, they will say one thing. They will say, we know this because we have this evidence, this piece of metal which has a certain stamping which we got from a pathological institute. And when it's examined, that's an interpretation of a very ambiguous piece of information. The institute from which they claim to have received the information turns out to be either non-existent or to be in some ways a false, just a facade. In other words, not a pathological institute in any way, but simply designed for soft power warfare, and et cetera, et cetera. We see this repeatedly, this pattern, and that's the basis for those conclusions as we present in this detailed report.
Thank you, Prof. Steinberg. In your view, would the way in which the board and staffing of HRW have taken place, as well as its funding and donor links, would that have anything to do with the way in which it would influence its outcome in terms of the reports and the conclusions?
Well, I missed again the volume's a little bit low. Could you just repeat the end of it? Would it have anything to do with?
Now, I was going to ask you whether the way in which it is funded, the way it has links with donors, the way in which it employs its staff and its board composition, would that have anything to do with the outcomes as we see in the report?
The primary funder today of Human Rights Watch has a very specific set of political and ideological objectives. And the individuals who are on the staff, as well as in a broad sense in the way in which they function, are consistent with that ideology. I don't think any organization that relies on donations from people who are politically or ideologically identified and committed will do something that will be inconsistent with that ideology. So funding makes a difference. The staffers are, and I will focus primarily on the Middle East region, what they call MENA, Middle East and North Africa, which is the area that I focused on in most detail. First of all, the top of that organization, the people who run that organization, have not changed in 15 years. Their backgrounds are all in political ideology. And they have hired people in that time frame at lower levels who are consistent with that particular ideology, that particular bias, that particular set of political objectives and soft power warfare framework. And so we see people who are experts in military activities which they claim to report on. That's important to note. At one time, Human Rights Watch had one military analyst, a senior military analyst. He was not experienced in particular. He did spend some time at the U.S. Pentagon in related areas, and it was very problematic, his conclusions. But since that person was no longer working it, I won't go into the details, but those are public record. For many years, Human Rights Watch has not had a military analyst. The people who write these reports know nothing about military situations. They know nothing about terrorist situations. They know nothing about military intelligence. And they've hired other people like that. What they are is a political organization, and they hire other people who are politically committed, ideologically committed to a certain position. And that's not only true for Israel, but it's throughout that division of Human Rights Watch, and I suspect true for other divisions as well.
I understand. So we have a report that is flawed in so many fundamental ways that you've just outlined, designed to fit a particular outcome, as you've described, and I think used the words distorted and in some cases untrue conclusions. When you have this kind of information designed to fit a particular political agenda and then carried extensively on internet, social media, and so on, would that be something that one has to be very wary of? Because these are the kind of information that ultimately influence political opinion, divide countries, affect their national interests, social cohesion, and ultimately could have the effect of bringing down a country. Would you care to comment?
All of the scenarios that you described are ones that we have seen in different conditions. With your permission, I'll focus on the social cohesion issue. Countries which are pluralistic, multicultural, have different population groups, and I will specifically talk about my own country, Israel, where we have approximately 25% of the population are Arab Israeli citizens. And within that group, we have Christians, Muslims, Druze, other Circassians, other minorities. And there is clearly a process that takes place. Human Rights Watch is, in many instances, been a leader in this process of creating situations that are designed to divide the country, to help exacerbate some of the issues or the points of friction that exist in a very complex situation. And when we have, for instance, whether from the inside the country or outside, a terrorist incident, and then Israel is condemned falsely for killing civilians in responding or for violations of international law, that very much creates a situation which inflames internal social points of friction. So the term social cohesion, I think, is very important, and this process of trying to use soft power. I apologize for coming back to that term, but it's a very shorthand form that is used a lot, and I've heard I think other witnesses that you've heard have used the same term, using soft power in order to create and expand the points of friction within a society like this.
Right.
It's something that is of great deal of concern, and it is also concern in other countries where these types of processes are taking place.
Well, Singapore is not dissimilar to the scenario you outlined because we are racially, religiously, culturally diverse, and we coexist as one, and lots of care and deliberate policy making have come into creating this situation. And these are significant fault lines, which are not just emotive, but they are, I think, fault lines which, if divided or acted upon, could have very significant bearing on undermining our national security interests. So I understand what you've been saying, and putting everything together, what we've said about the speed at which this is pervade false information, this kind of socially divisive, culturally divisive reports designed to undermine that cohesion. Would you accept that one therefore needs to be very careful with how we allow the proliferation of this kind of information online, which carries much faster, as you've said in your report?
I start with a realistic understanding of the process and the situation and all the factors. I try to, at least as an academic.
Yes.
I also, a term that we have not used in this discussion, but I'd like to introduce it, is the term intelligence. Intelligence, particularly in the sense of military intelligence in this case, that one, in trying to counter this process, being aware of what is being planned and how the processes work are essential to effective responses. And creating a situation in which there are resources devoted precisely to collecting that information, just as one would if one was monitoring the beginnings of what looked like a terrorist cell that was growing. Mm-hmm. And you want to check to see and know if they are in the process of obtaining explosives and other weapons. This is a weaponized process. And one has to know, do the intelligence that's necessary. Again, I come back to the Israeli case where I would say for 10 years, the resources in this area were lacking. The resources in understanding digital diplomacy, or digital, well, I would say the counter. Now there is a branch that's involved for digital diplomacy, and in the foreign ministry and in other ministries that coordinate. And so I would say the concerns that you outlined are extremely real, and the best way to counter them is to understand the process in detail, have people whose entire professional career definition is focused on this issue, so that they can work and be constantly monitoring and then use the tools that are available to both prevent, when possible, the placement, the posting, the publication of false claims, and also the analysis that goes with it. And then as it's like a fire, a wildfire that goes from one point to the viral process. To be prepared for that, because when these claims are made, it's not just the media, we haven't talked about this at all, but they will then come up in the United Nations Human Rights Council. Yes. Because the NGOs are very active there, and they will often find a very warm and inviting environment to repeat those claims and allegations. And it's important to know how to deal with each one of these battlefields in an effective manner, and it's a learning process. It's a learning process that also involves countries together. There is a serious effort being made to combine and coordinate the information that's gained. We win a few battles, we lose a few battles. We need to make sure that we win more and lose less.
Right. Thank you very much, Prof. Steinberg. That's all I have for you. I'm not sure if my colleagues may have some questions. I'll leave it back to the chairman. Thank you.
Okay. As there are no further questions, Professor Steinberg, thank you very much for your contributions. We appreciate it. We'll send you a transcript of today's proceedings. If there are any corrections to be made, please make the corrections and send the transcripts back to us. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I might, I'd like to thank your committee. I think what you're doing is extremely important, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak before you.
Right.
Thank
Thanks.
you.